Well, it's time, I think, to begin. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this online seminar of the Central Asia program at the George Washington University. We are meeting here in the middle of the summer to discuss Afghanistan, Central Asia, and the resurgence of the Taliban, which is, of course, the kind of the big news for the region, and that will continue to be probably in the forthcoming months. So we will be today looking at how the Central Asian states, both as state and as local community at the border, are managing the new situation of suddenly neighboring Taliban-government region. And for that, we have really three great speakers with incredible fieldwork experience. Let me very briefly present them. We will have Mélanie Sadozaï, who is a PhD candidate at my alma mater in Paris, the National Institute for Oriental Languages and Civilization, who is working on Gorno-Badakhan and globally on the region, the neighboring region of Tajikistan and Afghanistan in the Pamirs, and who is just back from Dushanbe yesterday evening. Then we will have Jennifer Brick Murtazashvili, who is Associate Professor of International Affairs and Director of the Center for Governance and Markets at the University of Pittsburgh. She has published a very famous book, Informal Order and the State in Afghanistan, and her second book, Land, the State and War, Property Right and Political Order, is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. And she has also been doing a lot of ethnographic and survey work across both sides of the Afghanistan Central Asian border. And last but not least, we will have Antonio Giustozzi, who is currently a senior research fellow at RUSI in London, who has published 6 or 7 or 8 books on the Taliban, the last one being Taliban at War with Oxford University Press in 2019, and who has been also doing a lot of fieldwork in Afghanistan, especially in Taliban region, but also in the northern region of Afghanistan. So you see a really incredible combination of scholars. Once again, welcome everybody. I will give the floor to each of them for about 10 minutes, and then I invite everybody to ask questions in the chat, and then for the second half of our time, I will be moderating the discussion. So Mélanie, would you like to begin?
Sure. Let me start by sharing my screen as I will be talking. You will see a time-lapse video of the Taliban's advance to the northern regions of Afghanistan. But first of all, let me thank you, Marlene, for this event, and thanks to the Central Asia program for putting together this event so fast. I will offer a view from the micro level, that's to say the level of the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. You can see on the map here the northern regions. I'm talking about this region, the very northern part of Afghanistan, and mainly all along the eastern part, so the northern areas of the Badakhan region. I will stop sharing my screen, otherwise you'll see my notes, and that's not super convenient, but you have an idea of the map and the region. So yeah, I will talk about the micro level, and I will elaborate in the 5 main points, and I hope this will help us kind of zoom out on what's going on in the Central Asian region in general. The first aspect I'd like to mention is the historic, actually the historic aspect of what happened at this border, the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan in the Badakhan region. The 5th of July 2021 is actually the first day that the border communities in Afghanistan have seen the Taliban. I'm talking about specific districts. So that was Shernan, Eshkashim, and Wakhan, which are to the east side of the border with Tajikistan, and they are mostly inhabited by Ismaili people. Under the Taliban regime in the late 90s, those regions were under the control of Ahmad Shah Massoud, and they were protected from the Taliban. So that's why it's very it's unprecedented to see the Taliban there when they arrived at the beginning of the month of July. What's historic too is how fast the Taliban took control of those districts. Nobody I spoke to along the border, whether in Afghanistan or Tajikistan, even government officials, The population, civilians, nobody was expecting the Taliban to arrive so quickly, and that's another key point to highlight. There were rumors spreading, of course. People knew that the Taliban were advancing north and getting closer and closer to the villages, but the fact that they fell so quickly was not expected at all. It all happened within 24 hours. The Afghan diplomats in Dushanbe said that during one night they could track the hour by hour that one district was falling, then two others, then three others, 2 hours later. So that's how fast it all happened. Now, along the border, we can very easily see the Taliban flag, which appears in strategic points, namely the cross-border bridges between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, and at the centers of the villages in Afghanistan. So in the district of Darwaz, the Taliban had already been in control before July 2021, but in the Ismaili inhabited areas, it's absolutely unprecedented. That's the second point I'd like to mention, the specificity of those cross-border regions in Badakhshan. They're mostly inhabited by Ismaili people, like I said, even though there are Sunni communities in Darwaz and also in the Wakhan Valley, where the ethnic Kyrgyz are living. So one feature of those border areas is the coexistence of these different communities, of the Sunni people and the Ismaili people, and they have been living at peace. Even today, as we're speaking, those regions are calm. Ever since the Taliban arrived, they've been quiet. No violence has been reported, no harm, no use of violence against the population. Actually, what happened was that before the Taliban arrived, the Afghan forces had already gone to Tajikistan. So there wasn't any opposition when the Taliban came into those villages at the border. The civilians were not willing to fight or to resist, and that's why it's been calm ever since. Now, what people say is that those Taliban, and I think Antonio will talk about this. Those Taliban are from Badakhshan, so they are aware of the coexistence of the communities along the borders, and so that's probably why they're not using violence. That may change. I will mention this later, but so far the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan has remained calm. So the third point is the Taliban policy. Very concretely, what happened was, like I said, the Taliban entered the villages without resorting to violence. Then they held meetings with the population, namely with village leaders, people who had responsibilities, so directors of clinics, for example, and they told them not to worry, that they wouldn't be violent against them, that the Ismaili people could continue practicing their religion. They did not have any issues with that, but they implemented new rules targeting women. So women now in those border areas, for the very first time of their lives, they have to wear, to cover their face, they have to wear the hijab, and they cannot go out without being chaperoned by a close relative who's a man. So that's very new in those areas. And women can still continue in some places to work. For example, there are women doctors. The Taliban told them they could work under those new rules, right? So that's going to be a real problem in the long run, to see, how it's going to raise concern on the conditions of those women and how they can actually continue to work properly. Now, another element regarding the Taliban policy is that in those areas, they act like government officials. They collect taxes from people, whether it be money or crops. They charge transit fees in the Khatlon province of Tajikistan. So they control the border crossing points all along the border. And there's one border crossing point which is actually functioning. They want to reopen also the cross-border markets. So they really want to show that they act like the central government. But the government of Tajikistan has refused so far, because they refuse to deal with any form of government that's not the Afghan government. So that's an interesting point. The fact that the Taliban are trying to show that they can be a functioning government. In my opinion, as long as the Taliban do not have the international legitimacy of being recognized as a state, they won't be able to deal with the Central Asian countries. So that's a hurdle for the Taliban in those cross-border regions. The fourth point I'd like to mention is we have to be very careful with information on social media. There's a lot of different news coming from different sources, and some of them have not been, are not true actually. They don't go along what's going on at the border. We have to remember that the Taliban arrived very recently, and there's no single policy that has been announced by the leadership of the Taliban, and even within Badakhshan, the same rules are not implemented in all the districts of Badakhshan. It varies from one district to another. In the Kunduz area, it's not like what's going on, you know, in the far eastern side of the border. So obviously that is impacting the bordering countries of Central Asia. Instability is much more visible on the western part of the border of Afghanistan. It's different on the eastern part, like I said. Now, for example, we could see news on the social media that people were crossing the border massively to Tajikistan, including families. Actually, the people who crossed the border into Tajikistan before the Taliban arrived were Afghan forces and civil servants. Most of them have been sent back to safe places in Afghanistan. Another news that was that were spreading was that Tajikistan was hosting a refugee camp in Badakhshan, near the city of Khorog. Again, that's not what we have seen on the ground. So there are some news like that that are spreading because on all sides there is, in my opinion, a battle on information. The Taliban opponents share news very fast. The Taliban are using their own propaganda very fast too, on Twitter, for example, on YouTube. So there is a critical need on this topic to triangulate information. I'm going back to my first remark when I was saying that what's going on there is historic. I think it's because it's historic that, you know, all kinds of news are spreading. So we need to be careful and triangulate information. To finish, I'd like to mention the future and the prospects for Tajikistan, because that's the question in everybody's mind. It's hard to predict anything, of course, but in my opinion, three elements need to be considered. If the Taliban leadership actually announces one single policy, especially regarding the work of women and women in general, then things are going to take a turn. As of now, there's no single policy across Badakhshan, like I said. There's no fighting, there's no shootings anymore, whereas before, when Taliban were not in control, across the border in some places, for example, across the town of Kalaykhum in Tajikistan, we could sometimes hear shootings. There's no more of that because they're in control and they're not using the force. At the same time, from the Tajikistani side, sometimes we could also hear music and people dancing in Afghanistan. There's no more of that either. So right now, yes, everything's quiet, but it's not for the better. And it's likely that it's a strategy for the Taliban to win hearts and minds before strengthening their power and enforcing tougher rules. So about the future, an interesting element is that there's no wave of refugees massively going into Tajikistan. Some ethnic Kyrgyz left the Wakhan Valley to go into Tajikistan, but now they're back. So all the refugees who actually crossed the border into Tajikistan were sent back to Afghanistan. The question is why? Why no refugees? Well, again, because the situation is calm, so people are not like facing massive violence. Also, they're afraid because they know what's going on under Taliban control in other parts of Afghanistan, so they try to adjust to the situation. And we're also talking about poor communities who don't have the means to cross the border. But again, if it gets tougher, the Tajikistani authorities will have to face waves of refugees, and they're ready. They officially said that they were ready for this scenario. Now, to conclude, what's interesting in Tajikistan is that we observe two levels of perception. The government is conveying the need for military support. The government is mobilizing thousands of servicemen along the border and is putting them in high alert. The 30 years anniversary of the independence is ahead in a few weeks, and Tajikistan does not want this day to be tarnished by a violation of its territorial sovereignty. But at the same time, they consider the possibility of neighboring a Taliban regime. So they have this very, sort of two-sided policy. But at the level of the communities along the border, and I will finish with that, people are not afraid. They're not afraid of the Taliban crossing the border. They're not afraid of seeing a spillover in Tajikistan, especially in Badakhshan. They're concerned about their co-ethnics in Afghanistan, and that they fear for them across the river. But they say that if the Taliban come, they will fight back, either themselves or their military. Life continues at the border. People still, live at the border, do, whatever they have to do. We don't really see a big situation on the Tajikistani side of the border. So to conclude, yes, the situation is calm. The borderland areas are calm, but the question is until when? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mélanie. Wonderful to have this kind of perspective from the ground. Let's now give the floor to Jennifer.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Marlene, and your colleagues for putting this panel together. And that was, Mélanie, thank you so much. That was fascinating, and learned a lot from your presentation. I just want to take things up sort of a higher level, just in terms of our unit of analysis, to talk about what's going on in northern Afghanistan and how that affects the countries of Central Asia, the relations between the countries, and their relations with the Taliban. So as Mélanie noted, that this offensive in the north really took everyone by surprise. It took the Afghan government by surprise. It really seemed to take some of the communities by surprise, and it has certainly taken Washington by surprise. But the situation in the north, I think we have to put into perspective into terms of what's been going on there. I think, as Mélanie noted, that many of the Taliban, they come from these communities. Antonio's written quite a lot about this, about the evolution of and the growth of the Taliban in the northern regions. But there has been a raging insurgency in the north for quite a long time. And if we look at the International Office of Migration statistics since 2013, about 1/3 of the population in northern Afghanistan has, since 2013, has either migrated outside of the country or is internally displaced. That's 1/3 of the population. So I think it gives us a sense of, yes, this is a dramatic move by the Taliban, but I think it may also explain why we're not seeing these large refugee movements, because there has been so much going on there over the past decade. But I think that the government of Afghanistan clearly has been taken by surprise here. That even among many people who I've spoken to, at the very last minute, there was real disbelief that the U.S. would actually leave, that the government was quite unprepared for what has happened. But what I'd like to do is discuss a little bit what's changed. In terms of, there's been so many comparisons made about Central Asia 20 years ago. I was working in the US Embassy in Tashkent at that time, and sort of had that view of what was going on in terms of Central Asian relations with the Taliban and so forth. But Central Asia and Central Asia's relationship with Afghanistan has changed quite substantially. The region is very, very different from what it was 20 years ago. So I think there's real limitations to the comparisons that can be made. First, the Northern Alliance groups in the north, and these are the co-ethnics that Mélanie has spoken about, right? So the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, who share co-ethnics in northern Afghanistan, they have been weakened dramatically over the past 20 years. And that is really the consequence of the state model that the US supported inside of Afghanistan. So the state model intentionally weakened these groups, so that the highly centralized state model is going to weaken groups, in the regions. And, leader after leader, well, the two leaders have tried to consolidate power in the center. Karzai did this, but Ashraf Ghani has really taken this to new levels. And many Afghan colleagues have observed that it seemed at times that Ashraf Ghani was much more interested in combating some of these commanders in the north than the Taliban itself. And that is a perception. So Ghani has been quite successful in mobilizing many of these Northern Alliance commanders, so they have been weakened. And so right now we see many of them in the north regrouping. And I think it's a real irony that the fate of the future of the Afghan government may not only depend on the national security forces that the US and the Afghan government has spent enormous resources strengthening, but also on these uprising dynamics that are taking place right now. And it's really hard to follow the dynamics of these uprisings. We're seeing, reports in different regions of their strength, not seeing, overwhelming force right now. I'd be curious to hear what Antonio has to say about this. So the weakening of the Northern Alliance is quite different. Its strength compared to it was 20 years ago. They may not be the same kind of player. Ahmed Massoud is talking about, gathering his resistance forces. We've seen Mohammed Atta-Nur in the north mobilize forces and call for resistance. So we'll try to understand the relationship between these forces and the government. Regional dynamics are very different. So 20 years ago, the Central Asian countries really tried to block themselves off from the Taliban to the extent that they could. Although Turkmenistan did have diplomatic relations as a neutral country with the Taliban, the relationship between Uzbekistan in particular was quite frosty, and it was almost if Afghanistan didn't exist. That governments in Central Asia really saw the Taliban as a threat, was very unsure of how to deal with the Taliban, and so, basically sealed their countries off hermetically from the Taliban. That has changed. And I think that there is a realization, especially Uzbekistan has been leading this. Uzbekistan in particular is really hedging its bets. It understands that the Ghani government is quite weak. It understands that the Taliban is resurgent. If Uzbekistan wants to pursue the economic growth model that it currently has, right, and that has changed inside of Uzbekistan. It's its own growth model. 20 years ago, Uzbekistan was autarkic. Islam Karimov relied on this, very insular economic growth model. President Mirziyoyev has a much more externally oriented model. His entire, government really depends on trade and exchange. And that now includes the Taliban, and that includes Afghanistan. So there is an understanding, I think, from Uzbekistan in particular, that if it wants to generate economic growth and deal with its own domestic economic issues, that it has to decrease costs of trade and exchange. And by accessing a port in South Asia would decrease those costs to trade substantially and generate economic benefits for their own country. So we're seeing that Uzbekistan now has quite amazing relations with the Taliban. I wouldn't say they're best friends, but they have quite cordial relations. And the Uzbek government has hosted the Taliban in Tashkent and Samarkand, visits them regularly in Doha. And has signaled to the Taliban that it's willing to do business with them, regardless of who is in power, over the next, decades. And that is a really significant shift from what we saw before. Tajikistan's relationship is a bit ambiguous. President Rahmon gave a speech last week where he praised the Northern Alliance, he praised Rabbani, he praised Ahmad Shah Massoud. So, the Tajikistan's relations with the Taliban isn't quite what Uzbekistan's relationship is. But if we're looking at what's happening at the border, we get an indication of what's to come. So as Mélanie pointed out, the Taliban controls border crossings into Tajikistan, and we're seeing the Tajik government deal with the Taliban as a normal government. Trade has continued. They're accepting trade papers from the Taliban, engaging with them as if it is the government. So, de facto recognizing them. So I think that tells us that the government of Tajikistan is willing to continue trade, regardless of who is in power in Kabul. We see the same thing in Uzbekistan, although the Afghan government still controls Hairatan, the border crossing between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. I think we have every reason to believe that if the Taliban were to take over that border crossing, that the Uzbek government would be willing to deal with them. So that is very new. So, and I'll wrap, Pakistan is actually another really important relationship. 20 years ago, Islam Karimov basically blamed the Pakistani government for the rise of the Taliban. There was a really icy relationship between the Pakistani government and Tashkent. We have seen that change dramatically over these past years. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, there was a regional summit in Tashkent, and Imran Khan and President Mirziyoyev signed a strategic partnership. And when I saw that happen, I couldn't help but think that this kind of relationship between the Taliban, the Uzbek government, and the Pakistanis had been somewhat cemented. I don't think that Tashkent or the Central Asian governments want the Taliban in power. I don't think if they had, a choice about who would be in power, it would be the Taliban, but they understand that this is the reality. And if there's instability in Afghanistan, if the Taliban are going to take over, then they want to know who they're dealing with rather than isolating themselves from them. So finally, what should Central Asia be concerned about over the next several years, several months, several weeks? What's going on in Central Asia vis-a-vis Afghanistan? Well, I think the refugee issue, many people have raised it. I think Melanie raised it, but we haven't seen the number of refugees that many people have anticipated. I think there's several reasons for that. One, go back to this issue of displacement that's already occurred. So many of the people who can leave and who are mobile have left. Also, Central Asia is not a place of migration in the imaginations of many Afghans. Because these borders have been closed for so long, when people think about migrating, they think about migrating to regional cities, to cities along the Ring Road inside of Afghanistan, or they think about Iran, or they think about Pakistan, or they think about Dubai, or they think about Turkey. So this is where we're beginning now to see refugee flows going from Afghanistan into Turkey. I just saw reports last week that the Turks are constructing a wall. I haven't seen this confirmed, but there's real concern in Turkey about the number of Afghan refugees. So it doesn't appear that they're headed to Central Asia. This is just, I think, not in the imagination of many Afghans that this is even possible. The economic integration projects, this is something that the Central Asian countries, and Uzbekistan in particular, is quite keen on. And it seems quite amazing that these economic integration projects, which seem so unfathomable because of the security situation inside of Afghanistan, may have a fighting chance, because pursuing them is actually in the interest of both the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan. And so if Central Asian countries can get agreements from the Taliban that they'll protect these infrastructure projects, they may have a way forward. So we may see these economic integration activities continue, but of course, civil conflict inside of Afghanistan doesn't make that easy. And then another topic I just want to end with, which I think hasn't gotten quite enough attention. I imagine it's something that Antonio will speak about, are the Central Asian fighters that are inside of northern Afghanistan. And I think this is something that is of enormous concern to Central Asian governments. And, for many, many years, we talked about the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, their associated groups that are in the north. But there has been a trend over the past several years and even the past several months, I think it's heightened, although hard to confirm because hard to get numbers on this, that these are Central Asian fighters who are now going into northern Afghanistan. And there was that dramatic takeover of my district in Badakhshan earlier this year by Central Asians, who had come from Tajikistan to join the Taliban or to join the fight. It's not clear that the Taliban wanted them there, but the Taliban certainly do have leverage over the Central Asian states because of the presence of the Central Asian fighters that are there. And I think this gives the the Taliban says that they have no designs over the Central Asian republics, that they will not allow terrorists to attack other territory. But I think that the presence of these fighters do give the Taliban leverage over the Central Asian states. So if the Central Asian states want to begin supporting and rearming the Northern Alliance, we see that the presence of Tajik and Uzbek fighters in the north who are of a new generation, right? So we know that so many Central Asians did go to Lebanon, went to Syria and went to Iraq to fight, to join ISIS. And now the opportunities to engage in this behavior, militancy, is right next door. And so this really presents, I think, a great threat to Tajikistan and to Uzbekistan. It doesn't take a lot of people to create chaos and chaos in the minds of the governments as well. So we recall in the late 90s, the IMU fighters came from Afghanistan into Central Asia, went through the border and the area near Boysun and the mountains in southern Uzbekistan. So this scenario was actually quite real. Not sure it will play out the same way, but the fear of militants coming from Central Asia, however few there may be, is certainly a threat. And I can imagine it's one area of leverage that the Taliban does have against the Central Asian states. So I'll leave it at there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for this wonderful perspectives on the different aspects of the relationship. Antonio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So, of course, there are a lot of issues to address. I think I'll start from discussing the role of Russia in all of this, because, of course, Russia has a lot of influence, whether they like it or not, on what the Central Asian states might do about the situation in Afghanistan, and also has got a lot of influence in Afghanistan, especially in the north. And basically, the Taliban have been opportunistic in their taking over of the Northeast, and more in general, of what they've been doing around the country. I think they themselves are surprised by the extent of their successes, but essential in their success has been the agreement that they managed to reach with Jamiat Islami, the party of Salahuddin Rabbani, which has essentially facilitated the takeover the province of Takhar and Badakhshan. And I think there is quite a bit of evidence that Russia and Iran have mediated between the Taliban and Jamiat Islami. They've done other things in other parts of the country, but we're specifically focusing on the north now. And I think that the strategy of the Russians, of course, they're not doing this because of just, the law of the Taliban, but I think the strategy is that they have for some years thought that the Taliban eventually would overcome. They have a very low opinion of the Afghan government and of their security forces. Is based on their intelligence and, of course, the observation of what has been going on in Afghanistan for years. And they believe that essentially the winning horse in this race was going to be the Taliban anyway, whether now or 20 years from now, that the only way to achieve stability was to somehow bring the Taliban in. And they come to the conclusion that the only way to do it, because they still have a reservation about the Taliban, they interacted a lot with them, the Iranians more than the Russian, but also the Russian the last 4 or 5 years, they've interacted a lot. And it was a mixed success. They know that there are issues, they've experienced issues with the Taliban. So the strategy is essentially to marry, if you like, the Taliban, to get them to form a coalition with elements of the groups, stakeholders, they've been rotating in the past around the Islamic Republic. Jamiat Islami is one, but they made an approach which is much wider than that. Some groups have not been approached. The Taliban said clearly from the beginning, we will never talk or make a deal with Dostum and his people. There are some other people they don't want to talk to. But basically, if you take, the so-called Mujahideen, which in fact are the old Mujahideen of the 80s and 90s, all of them have been approached by the Taliban. The Russians have mediated with the groups in the north, the Iranians more in the west. The Pakistanis have also helped in the south. But to focus on the north, the real success has been with Rabbani's faction for a number of reasons, but I think the main one is that Rabbani, of course, has been marginalized by President Ghani, whereas some other of his party colleagues have been co-opted. He was marginalized. And compared to some of his other colleagues, he's less interested in short-term gains. And he was more concerned about the future of his party if Ghani was going to remain in power. And if Ghani's successor in a few years from now would also follow the same line. So I think there was also the context was not been totally clear yet, but the recent dispute between Ghani and General Dostum in Faryab over the appointment of governor from the east, I think is what actually triggered this kind of 1992 scenario where the northern groups believing that it was the beginning of Ghani's crackdown, decided to act. So they were organizing themselves to basically, but it wouldn't be, of course, a complete autonomy, but essentially to try to limit the ability of the central government to influence and control the northern provinces. And they've been detected apparently by the security services as they were organizing this. And then this dispute escalated. The central government basically ordering the army not to collaborate with the northern militias against the Taliban. That allowed the Taliban first to drive a wedge between the militias and the army in the northwest, and then prompted Rabbani to accelerate the negotiations, seeing that all might be lost very soon, and make a deal, which I'm not sure whether it is a deal he had in mind originally. I think Rabbani, like others, were hoping in a forming a coalition among themselves and then make a deal as a group, as a coalition of all Mujahideen with the Taliban, but there's been no time for that. So Rabbani decided to race ahead and make this deal. So now the situation is that Rabbani's militias have not been disbanded. They're still there. They didn't resist the Taliban, but they're still there. They have the weapons. They've not been disarmed, contrary to the army and police. And well, this is verified, but the Russians appear to have paid a lot of money to Rabbani. I don't think it's a bribe. I think it's meant to consolidate the Jamiati militia into, if you like, a counterbalance of the Taliban. So yeah, form a coalition, but it's not the honeymoon with the Taliban. I think there are living concerns about where the Taliban will go once they take power. You know, I think the Iranians and the Russians are centrally on the same page on this. You know, they want to create a coalition where, you know, other partners apart from the Taliban are not just there, not like the Liberal Party in the German Democratic Republic. You know, they want them to play a more significant role in government, have a, you know, real stake in government, and for that, you know, if you want to paraphrase Stalin, you know, to demonstrate they still have the divisions. You know, so they want to make clear that these groups are not finished. You know, that the deal is not a sellout, but they want to protect the interests, and for that they need to show that they have fighting power. But this, I think, will become more apparent later. Now, this militia laying low, they are in the villages. The district centers are controlled by the Taliban, but the Taliban are quite thinly spread, especially in Taka, where they've never been very strong, but also in Badakhshan. You know, it was certainly not one of the provinces where the Taliban were strongest. Important to point out, the Taliban commander in the Northeast is a former member of Jamiat, and he always maintained a relation with Jamiat Islami. Many Taliban commanders had business joint ventures with the Taliban over exploiting mines, over smuggling. So between the two, there was already some kind of, you know, more than coexistence, I would say. So that's for the role of Russia in Iran and the impact that he has had. And then, of course, you know, the concerns are that the role of the Central Asian fighters in the region is still a source of debate. Of course, they're still there. Most of them now seem to be with the Islamic State. So that at least provides a good excuse, if you like, ideologically to the Taliban to fight them. But there are still a substantial number of them who are not aligned with the Islamic State. The Islamic movement of Uzbekistan is mostly now concentrated in the northwest, but there are other groups and also some members that I knew in the northeast. And I think there's also, you know, within Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, a desire to, if you like, recover some of the Central Asian that have gone over to the Islamic State. It's been, over the last couple of years, quite a bit of back and forth, people defecting, going to the Islamic State, coming back, then defecting again to the Islamic State. So probably they hope they can, you know, recover some of them, because the right way to fight and kill them is not going to be easy in the valleys of Badakhshan. You know, the Islamic State is well entrenched in some of the valleys around the district of Jum, and dislodging them from this area is going to be not easy. So they would rather try to co-opt or buy back as many of them as possible. But from the point of view of the Central Asian and Russia, the question mark, you know, these people are there. What are they up to? What kind of relation they have with the Taliban, and how this will evolve in the future. And the Russians, for what you can get from them, which is difficult, of course, to get something explicit from them. But my sense is that they are overall satisfied with the cooperation they had with the Taliban against Islamic State, especially in the Northwest, where they credited the Taliban essentially with crushing the Islamic State in the Northwest. Of course, Kabul has exploited the situation, trying to present that as their successors, but there was largely the Taliban who defeated the Islamic State in the region. Of course, the presence was not as strong as the Northeast, but it was significant at one point. So they see that at least they can, trust the Taliban to actively fight the Islamic State and to be more effective at doing that than the Afghan government has ever been. And that's not only in the north, but elsewhere in the country as well. Of course, the relation with Al-Qaeda, between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda is more controversial. And I think I agree with Jennifer that the interest of the Taliban at this point is, to contain them, to corral them, if you like, keep them there, tell them clearly, you're not allowed to do crazy things, but you can stay, and then we see. And they're trying to sign agreement. The Islamic movement has signed an agreement with Taliban where it commits itself not to expose jihad, so to say. But it's not only the fact that, of course, these are comrades in arms that fought alongside the Taliban. Many died fighting for the Taliban cause. So within the Taliban rank, many argue we cannot betray them, including many senior military leaders. But it's also the fact that they provide useful leverage vis-a-vis the Central Asians, vis-a-vis Washington, vis-a-vis a number of other countries. So contain them, but if you like, also keep them in reserve in case the other side does not deliver what the Taliban want, which is legitimization, which is of course open borders and whatever might turn up in the future. So I think this is a Taliban strategy. Actually, Al-Qaeda is not signing an agreement with the Taliban. They've resumed negotiation recently, but they're more reluctant. But the newest sign, some other Central Asian group like Imam Bukhari Jamiat has not signed. It's still work in progress. But whether they sign or not, I think the Taliban are not in a hurry to crack down on them in the near future. I think they can easily find a niche for themselves, and of course, some of them, not only in the Northeast, have been helping the Taliban in the recent battles or in controlling territory because of the shortage of manpower the Taliban are facing. So they're useful right now, and probably will be useful also in the future. I don't think there's any risk right now of, for the Central Asian countries, whether from the Taliban, but also from the Central Asian jihadists, is not something that can happen in the short term. It's not that simply you enter into, Uzbekistan would be really difficult because the border is more a river, so there's only one bridge. But even Tajikistan, something you can mount easily, and they know very well because all the attempts they've done in the past have failed, to establish a foothold, solid foothold in Tajikistan. They know that it's not something you can improvise. They start from a very low level. The kind of network that they've been able to build in Tajikistan for some time have collapsed. There's not much there. They can, offer an opportunity for, rapid increase in activities. So I think they're probably realistic about the fact that in any case, this is a long-term project and they will have to see how it works out with the Taliban. And the Taliban, as I said, the priority is gaining legitimacy internationally. They know the country can be run without money. The state will collapse without substantial, billions of dollars of aid coming from outside. And of course, the economy has to keep going. The borders are closed. The economy collapses already, not in a great shape. So they can't afford. And this is centrally something that the political leadership faces. I think the big issue is, and I will end on this because otherwise there's no time for the debate, is whether the political leadership of the Taliban will be able or is able to retain control over its fighters and its military leaders. Because whereas in Badakhshan they seem to have been quite disciplined, and situation seems to be under control. Already in Takhar is a bit more complicated, but if you go to the south, it's much more complicated. There have been attacks on NGOs, executions of NGO staff, which definitely not been authorized by the leadership. And now, the NGO Commission, the Taliban is reporting a number of commanders asking for measures to be taken, but the leadership is reluctant now to, get involved in this because they need the fighters, they need the military leaders to fight, not to be put on trial. So they're struggling to retain control. Some fighting in the cities was not authorized by the leadership. Some of the military commanders overstepped their mandate. I think there is a serious risk of the situation getting out of control. And of course, the Taliban are very stretched in terms of manpower, so they can't afford right now to isolate or to quarantine even the most radical commanders. And they need all of them. That's why they brought in even not only TTP, but they're bringing in more volunteers from Pakistan, but they also brought in the Central Asian who have not been fighting together with the Taliban for quite some time. So it's something not completely new, but new relative to what was happening for the last 2 or 3 years. So they are throwing everything they have into the battle. And so maintaining discipline, basically is a military commander's market now. It's not a political leaders market, and of course, if the conflict continues, if there is no ceasefire or no successful, no progress in negotiations, if this continues indefinitely, it's more and more likely that the military leadership will be able to assert itself vis-a-vis the political leadership, and that becomes more unpredictable because these are the people who are more skeptical about the need to have a running economy. They don't have the understanding, the sophistication to understand that, the economy has something they have to take into account, that international relations are important. These are people they fought since the age of 14 and understand very little except fighting. And they've seen a lot of violence. They've seen a lot of their comrades being blown to pieces, and the institute is going for revenge, essentially. So that's going to be difficult, I think, for the Taliban leadership to manage in the future. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Antonio, for this great analysis. Yeah, I didn't want it to stop any of you, even if I knew we would have little time for the question, because I think the 3 presentations were really fascinating and people need this kind of information, and we're more interested in listening to you maybe than having the discussion. But the chat has been very active. There have been a lot of conversation going on. And so I can see kind of 3 lines of discussion arriving. One, maybe turn toward Mélanie, asking if she could give more details or go a little bit even more deeper about women's status. I mean, you already talked about that, Mélanie, but if there are other things you could mention, and the cross-border activities on the bridge and the markets and how everyday life is working. And then a lot of question about geopolitics and how all the kind of big international and regional actors will be are reacting. And so Antonio already mentioned Russia, Iran. There is, of course, the question of the role of the US in trying to create new partnership with the Central Asian states, maybe in helping them preparing themselves. So if maybe Jennifer or Antonio could address the question of the potential revival of a US Central Asia military partnership around that change of situation. And also last kind of direction, we discussed a lot about Tajikistan, very little about Turkmenistan. And so any kind of information about Turkmenistan would be also very much welcome. I have to say, just the first event of a series we will be doing as long as needed. So in a few weeks, we will be meeting for another event, and we will try to go deeper in some of these questions, both on Turkmenistan and on the kind of the regional geopolitical reconfiguration, and of course, a lot of questions about China also. So maybe as we have only 10 minutes, I will give you the floor back for whatever you may have to discuss around this kind of local perspective, US Central Asia partnership, China, and the Turkmenistan question for whatever information we may have on Turkmenistan. Mélanie, would you like to begin?
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much for all these questions. First of all, so I was looking very quickly at the chat. I'd like, I saw some comments about, yeah, the violence. I'd like to make it very clear. What I was mentioning was that the situation is calm along the border in the northeastern part of Badakhshan. Of course, we should not downplay the violence that the Taliban are using in other parts of Afghanistan. So of course there's violence used by the Taliban, and Antonio mentioned that. But what I was talking about was mainly along the border in the northeastern part of Afghanistan. About the situation for women, it's again, I was talking about the Ismaili communities and the fact that it was unprecedented to see the Taliban implementing rules targeting the freedom of women. And so everything's very new for them, right? To be chaperoned and to cover their heads and to be under these sort of very extreme rules. It's new. What's going to happen? It's very hard to say. Again, I don't know if any like human rights NGOs will have access to these areas to sort of like help. I think it's very unlikely. I think the population is just going to adjust. And again, I have a hard time answering questions like that because it's been less than a month that the Taliban have been there, so we really don't know what's going to happen. But what we know for sure is that the first rules they implemented were targeting women, so they're the first, of course, victims of the Taliban rules. Now, about the cross-border life at the cross-border life in the cross-border areas. So I was along the border before the Taliban were there and right after as well. I couldn't see a lot of change actually because the cross-border bridges have been closed ever since 2022 because of COVID. So the cross-border markets and the cross-border bridges were closed in Badakhshan because of the pandemic. That was the official line of the government, and it was it's been very hardly impacting the population, both in Tajikistan and Afghanistan. It's hitting them in terms of financial like access to cheap goods on the Afghan markets. Now in Tajikistan they have to buy Tajikistani stuff for a much higher price. It's forbidding relatives to visit one another. It has a lot of different impacts on the communities, both in Afghanistan and in Tajikistan. And I can tell you that the people along the border really want the bridges to reopen and the cross-border markets to reopen because they want to have all the opportunities that those infrastructure are bringing. And also there are cross-border programs in terms of health. Doctors are used to cross the border to go to Afghanistan. Afghan patients used to cross the border to be treated in Tajikistan. That's not going on. Everything's on hold, but it has been on hold since the pandemic started. So the fact that the Taliban arrived is another element to take into account. But the fact that life was kind of stopped at the cross-border life was stopped is not new, and also it's hard to make a general assessment because there's one bridge that's functioning, and it's the one that it's in the Khatlan province of Tajikistan. This is the only bridge that's functioning. The other ones are not active. So the situation is very different from this bridge to all the other bridges. So again, it's hard to say along the entire border of Afghanistan, everything's the same. It's not true. So again, I'm going back to being careful with information and really listening to the voices of the locals. I'll leave it here because my colleagues have to answer as well.
Thank you so much, Mélanie. And we can go over our time for a few minutes because I think the interest is really very high. Jennifer.
Yeah, so just in terms of some of the geopolitical issues, I think it's been sort of well documented that Afghanistan is this one area where the interests and incentives of the United States, Russia, and China actually align quite well. So despite really bad relations right now between the United States and Russia, there's definite mutual interest in preventing conflict spillover in Central Asia. But the Central Asian states themselves are so quite vulnerable to all these geopolitical machinations. And it was really interesting that the Taliban went to Moscow. It was a couple of weeks ago, and they signed this letter, and they told Russia that they wouldn't allow. They had no territorial. They would honor Russia's border with Afghanistan. which was the Central Asian states, right? Not Russia's border, but it was this acknowledgement that Central Asia was their area of influence. So I think, as Antonio's pointed out, the way that Russia's brokering these relations inside of Afghanistan is really something that we should continue to pay attention to. You know, a lot of people have been asking this question about potential US military bases in Central Asia. I don't think we're seeing any evidence of that. We've seen these media reports, and I imagine many people who are on this call have a better sense in Washington about, you know, the reality of the U.S. actually taking Russia up on its generous offer to co-host, you know, U.S. intelligence assets at their bases in Tajikistan and Kirghizstan. I think that's one thing for us to remember as well. People have talked about the U.S. troops leaving Afghanistan, and there's a security vacuum in the region. And you know, I think we often forget that there's 7,000 Russian troops in Tajikistan alone. And that's not to speak of their presence in Kyrgyzstan. So Russia has this really robust military presence. I think the question is, you know, is China content to have Russia really acting on behalf of its own security interests? I don't think that there's, you know, the U.S. has lost a lot of credibility in the region. I don't think the U.S. is really seen at this point as quite a reliable partner. You know, the Central Asian governments, of course, I think to some extent would be keen on some military cooperation, but you know, nothing like we saw, you know, during the Karshi-Khanabad air base and those kinds of partnerships that we saw in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan 20 years ago. I think the U.S. really has a credibility issue, and a lot of countries, you know, in the region may be not willing to sacrifice you know, on behalf of the U.S. in that regard. So I don't think that we're going to see any kind of major U.S. presence in Central Asia anytime soon.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Antonio, the floor is yours for the concluding remarks.
As on China, there are different views about what China is doing, but if you believe the Taliban, what the Taliban says is that, and I'm translating what they say, because of course what they say is much more convoluted, but basically they say they see the Chinese as less a bit wary of Iranian and Russian brinkmanship. They think that what the Iranians and the Russians are doing is risky, you know, that could derail, and they'll be worried about that. And of course they don't have the same kind of, you know, they don't have a tradition having clients and allies inside Afghanistan that they can trust and marry to the Taliban, so to speak, you know. So also for them, this kind of route is not open. They do say that the Chinese basically decided to buy a stake in the Taliban and provide some funding, but they seem to be more interested in trying to put the some kind of negotiation back on track. You know, whether that is with the government in Kabul or with the Mujahideen, separately from Ghani and his administration. Probably they're not too concerned about that, but what they want is to have, rather than having a lot of bilateral deals between the Taliban and actors in different regions, which probably arguably has a risk of state collapse in the future, implicit in it, they rather see something more comprehensive happening, you know, with the big coalition of faction and groups and the Taliban coming together and reaching some kind of more comprehensive national level deal. So I think, you know, essentially the Chinese are more cautious, and I think they are interested in betting on both horses, you know, or any horse in the race. You know, they would rather be on all sides in the conflict and make sure that whoever ends up on top is not too far from China in terms of alignments and interest. And I agree that, you know, with regard to the role of Russia, America, United States, and Central Asia, I think at this point, you know, the perception locally will be that better not challenge the Russian and the Chinese by having an unauthorized, for sure, relationship with Americans or inviting the American over. I think it wouldn't be very popular in Beijing or in Moscow. Of course, if they're not on board, and I don't think they will be on board, you know. I'll stop here, thanks.
Wonderful where we are finishing just on time. That was really a fascinating discussion, and I'm very grateful to our three speakers for coming with so much information and analysis and kind of critical distance toward what we are usually reading and hearing about what is happening on the ground. I think that's really where scholarship is showing its best on this ability to comment current events with this kind of distance and analytical perspective. As I said, we will be, so the event is recorded, it will be available on our YouTube channel, we will make a podcast, there will be a transcript, so everybody who will be in need can have a look again at what we have been discussing here. And as I said, we will be continuing having other events in August, looking at different aspects of this ongoing transformation of the Afghanistan Central Asia relations. So once again, thank you everybody for this being with us today. Wonderful audience and discussion, and a very big thank you to our three speakers for their great presentation. Thank you all, and hope to be in touch very soon for continuing this discussion.
Thank you, Marlene. Thank you so much.